Good evening, I'm Anna Jabłońska. Welcome to Poland Daily. Poland is working hard to secure permanent American military bases on its soil. The biannual NATO summit, which started today in Brussels, provides an excellent opportunity to take another few steps on the way of achieving that goal. Polish President Duda had a bilateral meeting with President Trump, who praised Poland while criticizing Germany for being subservient to Moscow.
Polish President Andrzej Duda stated today that any power which is tempted to threaten global security must be aware that NATO is united, acts in unison, and that there are no problems in transatlantic relations. He also stressed that the alliance must streamline its command and control system so that NATO will be able to react swiftly in case of crisis. I want to underline that we remain committed to the concept NATO 360 degrees, which means that we keep our eyes on all fronts, not just the eastern flank where my country is located, but also the south where Polish soldiers are fighting the Islamic State in the Levant and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Poland is among the leaders of NATO. We spend the required percentage of GDP on our armed forces. We will spend 2% of GDP this year, and that figure will gradually increase to 2.5% in 2030. President Duda underscored that the leaders of Ukraine and Georgia are also participating in this year's summit. He stated that he has high hopes of the two countries not only having the status of friends of NATO, but that they will also become full-fledged NATO members. During the first day of the summit, President Duda met with President Trump to discuss Polish-American military cooperation and especially the status of US troops stationed in Poland. However, so far, details from the meetings are sparse. It is expected that we will find out more at President Duda's press conference tomorrow.
Today, the NATO summit in Brussels brought about a heated debate between all member states and Donald Trump. The meeting focused on the subject of defense and control, in particular on the fact that Russia has control over several countries by using the Nord Stream gas pipeline to pull strings. The American president began by recalling the obligations of all members of the pact.
Over the last year, about $40 billion more has been given by other countries to help NATO, but that's not nearly enough. The United States is paying far too much, and other countries are not paying enough, especially some. So we're going to have a meeting on that, and the Secretary General has worked very hard on that. He understands the problem, and hopefully we can get a result. This has been going on for decades.
Trump was immediately answered by the Secretary General of the North Atlantic Pact, Jens Stoltenberg.
So we see that last year we had the biggest increase in our defense spending across Europe and Canada in a generation. We see that all allies have started to increase defense spending.
Another issue is Russia's continued influence on the members of the pact through the supply of energy. And here a storm broke out. Donald Trump suggested that Germany is a Russian hostage, pointing out that by investing in the Nord Stream 2 project, countries paid the money to Moscow's treasury without transferring funds to defense.
But Germany is totally controlled by Russia, because they were getting from 60 to 70% of their energy from Russia and a new pipeline. And you tell me if that's appropriate, because I think it's not. And I think it's a very bad thing for NATO, and I don't think it should have happened. And I think we have to talk to Germany about it.
Jens Stoltenberg, when asked by journalists about how to understand the American president's strong words, defends him and emphasizes that all member states have one goal.
Of course, President Trump has a very direct language and message on defense spending, but fundamentally we all agree.
I was a witness when part of Germany was under Russian control, and I'm very happy that today we are united in freedom as the Federal Republic of Germany. Therefore, we can say that we create our own policy and make our own decisions.
The main problem is the recurring issue of member states spending 2% of GDP on defense. Of course, the US spends the biggest chunk of money on this goal, and hence Trump's concern for the contribution of the other countries.
It remains as steadfast as ever, and we show that, of course. We lead by example, and not only by meeting the NATO targets of spending 2% of our GDP on defence, but also 20% of our defence budget on equipment, and in the way in which we deploy thousands of armed forces personnel on NATO operations around the world.
The Brussels summit will last until tomorrow. In addition to Nord Stream 2 and the issue of financing the armed forces, the 4x30 initiative will be addressed, according to which NATO, starting from 2020, is to be able to deploy 30 troops battalions, 30 squadrons of aircraft and 30 warships within 30 days.
The President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, took part in the anniversary celebrations at the grave of the unknown soldier and later on Volhynia Square. Between 1943 and 1945, over 100,000 Poles living in Volhynia and eastern Galicia were murdered by Ukrainian nationalists.
Poles genocide was a process planned by the leaders of the Ukrainian nationalist organization and carried out with bestial cruelty by the troops of the Ukrainian insurgent army and ordinary Ukrainians residents of Volhynia and eastern Galicia. The culmination of the Volhynia massacre was Bloody Sunday on July 11, 1943. This is why on this day, the National Remembrance Day for genocide victims is celebrated. Polish President Andrzej Duda took part in the anniversary celebrations at the Ołyka Cemetery. He appealed to identify the victims so that the nameless graves be personal. We need to remember this mutual history, but in order to close it, to go forward, the graves have to be personal so that the victims' families are able to come here, light a candle and shed a tear. Thousands of Poles who died on July 11, 1943 were murdered in churches during Sunday Holy Masses.
Napadów w dni świąteczne, wszystkie święta katolickie.
It didn't happen by accident because there is an easier access to victims, but such attacks on public holiday in Volhynia was as much as 70. But it was also a public struggle not only with Poles but also with the Catholic faith and its representatives, also with the approval of the clergy who sometimes even blessed the weapons used in the crime. However, as Ewa Siemaszko adds, among the Ukrainians there were also those who helped Poles.
Dawali sygnał, że grozi niebezpieczeństwo.
Of course, there wasn't many of those acts of help, especially taking into account the magnitude of this crime, but in those days, every such piece of good counted. The horror experienced by the victims of the Volhynia massacre was described in the book Hate, written by Stanisław Strokowski, who as a child became a witness of the nightmare in the Polish-Ukrainian borderlands. In Volhynia, within one day, on July 11th, the Ukrainian fascists turned around 100 villages into hell, slaughtered several thousand Poles, burned 4 or 5 churches together with the priests and the faithful inside. Grandparents, uncles, distant relatives came to our home and they began to confer. At the time I was 7 and I had a fever. I absorbed everything they said, and I heard terrible things. I started realizing that the Ukrainians were cutting down Poles, tearing children apart, nailing them to fences, cutting people in two using saws, cutting up pregnant women to take up their fetuses and replacing them with cats. I had nightmares and was hiding under my bed. Although the Polish side wants to resume the works to identify victims of the genocide, it might be difficult for Ukraine. The Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance still denies that it was a genocide by calling it the Polish-Ukrainian War and falsely claiming that about 50,000 died on both sides. According to Polish estimates, over 100,000 Poles died in the Volhynia massacre, while 5 to 10,000 Ukrainians lost their lives in the retaliatory actions of the Polish underground, from 5 to 10,000 Ukrainians.
Thank you for watching Poland Daily. Coming up next, Poland Daily Weather and Poland Daily Business. Good night.